Thank you, Meredith, and thank you everyone for being here today. And a small caveat, as Meredith mentioned, this is 2021. So we are having a little bit of technical difficulties with the way that these slides are presenting. So my apologies, we will work through that. So this is not exactly the format that we thought it was going to present in, but we will do fine in this PDF form. So thank you so much for being with me today. And we're going to talk today about understanding the importance of inclusion in education. As Meredith said, my name is Lisa Paddock, and I am the Insource Parent Liaison to the Indiana Department of Education. And today we're going to talk about inclusion and what it is and what it isn't and why it is. So thank you so much for taking time today to be with me and to discuss inclusion. First, we always start with a legal disclaimer. I'm not an attorney. This information is provided for educational purposes and does not constitute legal advice. It is intended to provide general background of special education process. And of course, as you know, law is constantly changing and is very dependent on individual facts. If you're needing an attorney, please seek a competent attorney prior to taking any legal action. So a little bit about Insource. We are one of the first 5 parent training and information centers. It was established in 1975, and we received one of the first 5 federal grants awarded in 1976. I myself have been with Insource for close to 19 years, and I've seen a multitude of changes in educational services for families, and I've seen Insource grow along the way as we served more and more families. Our current grants right now are from the Indiana Department of Education and the U.S. Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services and Administration. That is how we receive the majority of all of our funds. You may or may not have heard about Insource, but here are some of the ways that we help. Insource covers the whole state of Indiana. We have regional staff that cover each area in Indiana. So no matter where you live in Indiana or no matter where you teach in Indiana, there is a regional program specialist that can help you, help the families, help your community stakeholders all throughout Indiana. So some of the ways that we help has to do with the fact that we are embedded in our communities. We have regional offices throughout Indiana. Individual phone assistance, that is probably the largest part of what we do. Talking on the phone to families, talking on the phone to schools and to community stakeholders. We do parent training classes. We also do trainings with schools and community partners, because basically we are here to help families understand the special education process. We are a pivot to that process because we feel that families cannot make informed, educated choices if they do not know all of their options and they don't understand what the options are. Additionally, we are one of the few parent training support centers that actually do still allow individuals to go and attend meetings with families. So we are very happy that we still attend case conferences with families. We feel it's vital, very important for family support. Additionally, we have a plethora of resources online on our website. We have a calendar of training events. So all throughout the state, we are here to help families, schools, community stakeholders for information and resources. Okay, so today we're going to be discussing inclusion and what inclusion is and what inclusion isn't. Okay, and so one of the questions today has to do with what criteria must children with special needs meet to be included in general education. And we hear that a lot of times, especially from families when their children are young. And the answer to that, of course, is there is no criteria. Children with special needs do not have to prove themselves that they can be included. And all along in this training, we're going to talk about IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and why we do what we do. It is the fact that IDEA is the underlying foundation for inclusion. all the way from early intervention, all the way till a student gets out of school at 22. And that idea is the foundation that states that everyone has a need, an opportunity, and a right to be involved in their community and in community-based educational opportunities in their least restrictive environment. Okay, so today we are going to talk along the way. We're going to talk about myths. We're going to talk about what education looks like in an inclusive setting. So I hope that this will be very helpful as we discuss what we will learn today. Okay, we're going to talk about the definition of inclusion, the benefits of inclusion, how inclusion is built into the federal and state laws, and 6 important principles of IDEA and how they support inclusion. One of the very important points to understand about an inclusive education is it does not mean that a student is put into a classroom without appropriate support. And that appropriate support means appropriate support for the teaching staff and appropriate support for the student. They go hand in hand. A teacher must be supported for them to teach, and a student must be appropriately supported for them to learn. So that is what inclusion is. It is appropriate supports for both parties to make sure that that child can access their FAPE, their free and appropriate public education. Okay, the definition of inclusion is the act of being included within a group or a structure, and that comes from the dictionary. So as we start this conversation, there are some words that I would love to throw out there to have you think about. Okay, these are words that I often think about. I think you will think about when we drill down and think about how is someone included in a community? How is someone included in a classroom? And some of those words are words like valued, ability to participate, a caring environment, and even the word with. And the word with has to do with the fact that this individual is not separate from the group. This individual is a valued part of the group and operates along with all the other components, all the other people in the group. So inclusion is the act of being included within a group or structure. And inclusion means meaningful inclusion, where their input is valued. And it does not mean just simply being in the same room. Okay, so what is inclusion? So IDEA talks about the fact that there are more and less restrictive environments in an educational setting, and even in a young child setting. So today we're going to talk about the fact, to the maximum extent appropriate, students are to be educated in their general education setting. And the fact that supplementary aids and services can be made in that general education setting. And some of those supplementary aids and services it means aids, services, and other supports that are provided in extracurricular activities, general education classes, and other opportunities for a student to be able to access that environment. So this picture always gets people talking, okay? So years ago, back in 1975, when the law changed and children with disabilities were now allowed to go to school, the picture looked a lot like the picture on the far left of exclusion. So many times special education classes were in the basement of churches, or they were most certainly in total separate wings of schools, because the idea was, okay, Children with disabilities could now be educated, but they would not be educated with the other students. They would be educated by themselves. So this is the exclusion model, where a child will be taught, but they would be separate from everyone else. The picture in the middle is segregation. So they were present, but not present in the same classroom at all. They were often only in a self-contained classroom. So now perhaps they had moved into the same school building, but they were not in that general education setting at all. And they spent most of all of their day in a separate classroom. The third model is getting a little better. It's integration, okay? And the student with special needs was physically located in the general education classroom, but may have been off to the side or may not have been included in what was being taught for the majority of the time. So it is better than the other two models, but it's still not what we think about when we think about inclusion. And so our model here is inclusion, that students with different abilities are incorporated into the general education classroom and with the same curriculum with supports. And that's really the difference in appropriate inclusion and inclusion that does not offer supports in the appropriate way. And of course, those supports are decided by the case conference committee. But when a child has an IEP, that committee comes together to decide what does that child need to access their FAPE, their free and appropriate public education, which is exactly what IDEA was set about to do. So when we look at the picture of inclusion, that is a picture where children are being educated together and appropriate supports are in place. So what will we learn? The definition of inclusion, and we're going to talk about what are the benefits of inclusion. We're going to talk a little bit about some studies that have taken place that show the benefits of inclusion, and there are references on the slides to these studies, and there's lots of studies out there now that talk about educating children in their least restrictive environment and how with appropriate supports everybody benefits. The fact that inclusion is built into the federal and state law. And we're also going to talk about the 6 important principles of IDEA and how they support inclusion. And it is really important to know that all of these principles of IDEA are important in order to make an inclusive education possible. Okay. So first, we're going to talk about one of the myths. My child needs a separate classroom in order to learn. Now, there are times when a child that is learning at a significant delay might need time to work on their own goals, and that's fine. But in general, the research has proven that we don't have to totally separate a child in a separate classroom in order for them to learn. There can be opportunities provided in the IEP for a child to have their work modified in those earlier grades and to have time pulled out if that's needed for them to work at a lower level curriculum. Now, many times that support can be provided in the classroom in an integrated manner, but there are most certainly, it can happen to have that child pulled aside or worked with separately if their work needs to be modified. But there are no longer studies showing that children with special needs need to be in a separate classroom in order to learn. There are most certainly studies that show the fact that being in a general ed classroom, being exposed to that general ed curriculum, even if they're not in grade level, benefits that child significantly, and it benefits peers. And we'll talk about how that also happens in a little while. Okay, another myth. My child needs a self-contained class. She feels safe and comfortable there. Now, sometimes that does happen. And part of what we sometimes have to have a discussion with a parent and public agency rep about, all at a case conference, all has to do with what is the least restrictive environment for a child to be in where they can meet their goals. And sometimes it is a struggle to think about a child with a more significant disability in a general education setting. But research has shown that as we start children off very early and have them understand each other and respect each other and work together in teams, this is beneficial for all. And data clearly established that students with disabilities included in regular education classrooms were uniformly and systemically positive in their motivation and fulfillment, and reported being focused and successful academically and socially. And I love that. I love that quote, because one of the things that happens when everybody is in Mrs. Smith's third grade classroom, even if they throughout the day come and go and are involved in a variety of different activities, including advanced activities or modified activities, or some other type of activity, is altogether they're Mrs. Smith's third graders. They are not the special education kids. They are included and they are valued in that general education setting because they all belong to that general education teacher. Next myth we'll talk about: having students with special needs in the same class with typical students will keep the typical students from learning. And honestly, most of the time what this deals with has to do with behavior, okay? But we need to understand that instead of necessarily always going to thinking of removing the child with behaviors, we want to work to appropriately support the child with behaviors, to look at that behavior assessment and behavior plan and appropriate supports, so that that child that perhaps might have some needs that someone might be concerned about being distracting, that student has the appropriate support, as does the teacher, so that they are able to stay in that general education classroom as long as possible. And then there is a plan that supports them if they have to leave that general education classroom, okay? And as it states here in the study, the inclusion of students with disabilities does not lead to negative consequences for typically developing students. That is, if appropriate supports are put in place, you will find, as we talk about later, that the students work together, they support each other, they even provide their own peer relationships of encouragement and support, because they know that they are partners, they are classmates, and we want there to be appropriate support in that classroom so that all students feel safe and welcome. And if there is a student who cannot stay in that classroom for all of the day, they are still there for the longest period of time that they can be, because it is important, and by law they don't have to earn their way there, but they should be appropriately supported there, so that there is a plan and what is going to happen if by chance they are working on the skill set and they're having a struggle and they need to leave. There's a good plan for that. But the general expectation is for them to be in that general education classroom with support. Next myth: a typical child will learn bad behaviors from students with special needs. Well, as we all know, kids are kids, and kids with and without special needs are going to have behaviors. So one of the things the studies have found is students without disabilities experience increased self-esteem and an overall improvement of their self-concept when taught in an inclusive setting. Peer models can be a wonderful support. And as children learn about differences in each other, they're able to recognize their own strengths and their own opportunities for growth, and they're able to see that with other students. And they will come alongside and find good ways to support each other if they get to know each other. And that is part of what is so important about not being further down the hallway in a separate classroom all day, but being right there, part of your general education setting, and having the educational supports to help provide what is needed in that classroom. Okay, so our next myth: what if other parents don't want a child with special needs in the class? Well, I hope that the administration and each school across America are now able to share with parents that the child with any kind of different abilities has every right to attend in a general ed classroom to the fullest extent possible, and that they would also know how important it is to support their staff so that the child and the teacher and the whole classroom is supported. Many things that work for a child who has special health care needs work for other children. So that universal design set up in a classroom is beneficial for all, because many times in that classroom, there are other children with special needs that are not recognized. Or maybe that child has a 504, or we may have children that have different learning styles, different sensory needs. In a classroom, every child is unique, just like every teacher. So when we come to a classroom, those children all have rights to be in those classrooms, and we want to have all of them safe, and we want to have them all supported appropriately. So one of the things that we talk about all has to do with helping families and children understand that when they get out of school and they're in the workplace environment, they're going to have individuals with different abilities and needs in their work environment. So we want to start early with that thought of sometimes people do things differently. Sometimes people act differently or believe differently, but we can still have a cohesive model of cooperation and respect. And by doing that, we also gain new insight about ourselves and insight about others, and friendships with people who perhaps are not exactly like us. And that's a very valuable skill to learn. Okay, so we are going to talk a little bit now about some of the benefits of inclusion, okay, in 3 areas: membership, knowledge and skill, and relationships. Okay, so the first outcome that we're going to talk about has to do with membership. So some words that come to mind with membership: increased comfort and awareness, growth in social cognition, improvement in self-concepts, and warm and caring friendships. So when you are part of a classroom, and many times we will see these friendships grow from early kindergarten all the way to graduation. And this belonging, this membership opens kids' eyes to the fact that people are different and the students in their classroom are different. And that is exactly what they will find in the real world. Everyone in the world is different and unique. And when we talk about raising awareness about being part of a community, that makes us think of a lot of things. That makes us think of our educational setting. That makes us think of our maybe our community religious setting. That makes us think of our community stakeholder setting. So when we think about membership, and we think about the fact that children are children, and children who are educated in inclusive settings belong, then we now have created a classroom where everyone is welcome, and that the expectation for the school is the fact that everyone wants to work together to appropriately support this student, so that all kids belong to the teacher, all kids belong to the administrator. And that is one of the large values of inclusive education. When I started, it really was Mrs. Smith's special education classroom. Those kids belong to Mrs. Smith in a special ed classroom. And I've really valued seeing the change in that philosophy, that the general education teacher now works alongside the special education teacher, and these are our kids together. Relationship outcomes. I drew upon this a little bit before about what social emotional benefits there were in inclusion, and here are some of them listed. The fact that children who are on a more typical developmental scale are working alongside a student that might have delays is vital. It helps each student to understand diverse social networks, which they are going to run into once they get out of school. It helps build increased patience and willingness to help and serve others. And the understanding that people process things differently, that something that I might not struggle with might be something that you do, and something that you struggle with, I might not. That back and forth in the relationship building, when we have an inclusive setting, is vital to set the stage for when the bus stops coming. Because our workplaces and our community is made up of a variety of different individuals with different beliefs, with different abilities, and we need to start early in understanding how to work together and how to partner. Additionally, knowledge and skills. Now, this portion is where we also start talking about things like accommodations and modifications. So I know there's been lots of buzz about the words accommodations versus modifications over the last 10 years. But the easy way, I think, to think about accommodations all has to do with things that need to occur so that this student can access the curriculum, whereas modifications means we're going to change that level of curriculum. We need to do something different to that. But in that case conference, that is where these areas are discussed. Does this student need accommodations, or will this student need modifications? We all learn at a different rate, and that is why the professionals are there. That's why the teachers are there, the special education teacher, the reading strategist, in order to plan in this case conference all about what this child needs. Participating in tutoring programs are a variety of different things that will help this child that perhaps might not be on grade level to hopefully close the gap. That's what goals in an IEP are for. This student would not have an IEP if there was not a gap in a skill. So that's what those goals are for. And of course, help from therapists and learning specialists in order to try to help close that gap and to address the reason the child has an IEP. Okay, so here are some of the guiding principles of inclusion. And we have talked about these. We've talked about the right that children with special needs have to participate in those same community and neighborhood activities and programs, that they need to provide, they need to be provided with supports necessary for them to do that, and that they bring inherent gifts to their community, and they must be afforded the dignity of risk. And that can also be very difficult at times because we all, as teachers, as parents, we want to protect our kids, our students, but we have to understand that all students must be afforded the dignity of risk, and that communities will support the participation of children in the community. And as we are expecting it to be, all children getting equal access to educational opportunities. Okay, so additionally, we're going to talk a little bit more, as I said, about the 6 important principles of IDEA. We've already hit a little bit on IDEA and inclusion and the law. So I'm going to skip over this for the sake of time, but basically it talks about a free and appropriate public education, so that that student, when they leave school, can go and move further in education, employment, and independent living. Okay, so we are now going to talk about inclusion in the law and the different parts of IDEA. Part A, Part B, Part C, and Part D. And probably you're much more familiar with Part B. But let's just real quickly go over them. So Part A includes the general provisions of the law. It establishes the purpose and defines the terms. Part B is what we talk about most of the time, for students ages 3 to 22, and it addresses the educational services for those students. Part C is early intervention for children birth to 3, and in Indiana, that's First Steps. I used to be a First Steps service coordinator, and even that part talks about a child receiving services in their natural environment, wherever that would naturally be for a 2-year-old. And then Part D includes programs and activities such as training, personnel, staff development, research projects. It's the national programs, and it also helps govern the parent training centers like Insource. And all states have a parent information training center, and some states have more than one. Insource is one of the largest ones, and we attend more case conferences than any in the nation. And we are, again, state and federally funded. In IDEA, they talk about findings, and the premise of IDEA is built on this. That disability is a natural part of the human experience, and that disability in no way diminishes the right of the individual to participate or contribute to society. And that was part of what we were seeing before, was the fact that everything was separate and it was different. Children were not receiving access to the same education and educational opportunities and experience. Now we would not think about saying kids with different abilities can't attend prom. We wouldn't think about that now, okay? But not that many years ago, any of those physical barriers would have been a problem. And many children, when they were educated, it was not even considered to be educated in their local school at all. They had to always go to a school that had an elevator, or always go to a school that had a certain program, where now we most certainly have meaningful discussions about why can this child not be educated in their local homeschool. And that's not all. I like this slide very much. Improving educational results for children with disabilities is an essential element of our national policy of ensuring equality of opportunity, full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency for individuals with disabilities. So one very concerning issue all has to do with the fact that the employment and underemployment rate for individuals with disabilities is very high. And there's lots of organizations working on this. But part of this all starts in the very beginning in education, and being prepared and working toward a diploma and working toward educational opportunities. And even if that student is not going to get a diploma, perhaps, ensuring that for that individual's interest, that school and family and individual work on their interests and gain as many skill sets as possible so that they can be economically self-sufficient when they leave school. Okay, I'm just going to barely touch on First Steps. As I said, First Steps is our early intervention system in Indiana for children birth to 3. And even that discusses the fact that a child should receive their services in the area that is a natural environment. And for a child that's a 2-year-old, that natural environment might be home or daycare. And that's where IDEA says that they should receive the early intervention services. So that is part of why we talk about IDEA is the foundation for a student receiving services in their least restrictive environment so that they are together with peers that do and do not have special healthcare needs. Okay, we've talked a little bit about the school system, Part B. Okay, so I feel like we've already covered that area. Now, we are going to talk a little bit about curriculum because that's one of the big questions that is always asked. When we come to a case conference, then everyone says, well, but this child is not on grade level. And that is part of what Project Success does so well, is they work with schools in order to help them understand how to help that child, how to write goals, how to also additionally expose that child to grade level standards. So this link here, you can always just go to the DOE's website and put in standards, and it will come up with the standards for the grade level. And that is such a wonderful benefit that parents can look at those from past years, because they know if their child perhaps has a delay and they are not on grade level, they can look at the grade level standards to see what they're doing in third grade. It is very important for students who are below grade level to be exposed ongoing to grade level curriculum. And when you look at goals, you look at how do we work to close that gap as much as possible in order for that student to come as close to grade level as possible. Okay, I mentioned before Part D of IDEA, and Part D has to do with the undergirding and the foundation to make all of these programs work. And how do teachers get supports? How do parent information training organizations get supports? So we don't hear much about those national activities to improve outcomes, but those are really a very large part of IDEA to lay the foundation and to help work toward the expectation of what a child would be doing. Okay. We are going to move on here. And we're going to talk a little bit about the relationship between the federal and state law. So probably you already know, like we talked about, IDEA is federal law. I like to tell parents that it's the large umbrella, and Article 7 is Indiana's special education law. And a state special education law can do more, but not less than the national law. So here are the 6 principles of IDEA that I have been referring to back and forth along the way. And you can see each of these, and each one of these puzzle pieces are an important part to accessing a FAPE, a free and appropriate public education, and all of the components of it. Okay, so you will hear that term a lot, just like I'm using it. And people will say, my kid deserves a FAPE. Well, what is a FAPE actually? So it is education designed to meet each child's unique needs, provides access to the general ed curriculum, meets the grade level standards established by the state, and the child receives educational benefit. And years ago, there was not an expectation as far as that for students with disabilities, especially those with significant disabilities, to be part of general education curriculum or to even be exposed to that. And that has all changed. And as parents look for that FAPE, these are some of those different components that they are discussing. Additionally, educational evaluation. The child has a right to have an evaluation, an appropriate evaluation to determine the needs of the student. And that is important, and there is a process to that. And families need to understand that. And that evaluation is what helps determine eligibility category in services. The eligible student, it means a disability must adversely affect educational performance. Okay, that can be academic, functional, or both. And please keep in mind that you will have a copy of this because I know we're coming close to the end and we're getting down to the last couple of minutes. But it is important to understand that a child not only has to have a disability, but the disability must adversely affect educational performance in some way. It can be all behavioral, it can be all academic, or it can be both. And then, of course, the IEP is written, and these are all the components of the IEP, because you will not need an IEP if you don't need goals. If you don't need to close a gap in the student's present level of performance to where you would like them to be, you won't need an IEP. So these are all the things that are in an IEP. And of course, the first IEP is called the initial, and it requires the parent to sign that IEP to start services. Any other IEP after that can go into effect with the 11th day rule if it is not contested and where a parent asks for a meeting. That student also is to be educated, as we've been talking about all along here, in that student's least restrictive environment, ensuring that they have the appropriate special education and related services. So we talk a lot, all of this about LRE, okay? There's a continuum of LRE all the way from hospital, residential setting, homebound setting, all the way to the general education. And in Indiana, we in general do a pretty good job about having a large percentage of our kids, about 77% or so, I believe, in general ed, but that's still below what we would like. We know that without a doubt, there may be some children that by nature of their disability, their least restricted environment may be a more self-contained setting, because years ago they would have been in a residential setting. And that is all determined in that case conference committee. So there will be kids that cannot handle or take part in general ed all day long, even with modifications and lots of support. And that's fine. The idea though is the conversation should start in general ed and start with support before we ever think about pulling a child out, okay? And education with same age peers is what the goal is. And before we start pulling a child out to a separate classroom, we want to make sure that their need is significant enough that it cannot be met in that general education classroom with their peers. This slide lists the continuum of services, so I won't spend very long on that, but by law, there must be a continuum of services. And that also is included even in the preschool 3 to 5-year-old, there's a continuum of service. There is a way to resolve disagreement between parent and school, and you can find that on the DOE's website. You can find that on our website. And a family can ask to reconvene a case conference, okay? They can have a facilitated IEP meeting. They can also ask for mediation, or they can request due process hearing. So those are all things a parent can do if they disagree with what the school is proposing. And those are important components for a family to know what to do if they don't agree. Procedural safeguards are given out at least once a year, and additionally at a discipline meeting by like a manifestation determination. And it's important for families to know what's in those procedural safeguards. Insource is listed along with some other organizations that can help. And it is important for families to read over those procedural safeguards so that they are fully informed to be able to participate in the special ed process. Here are some of the parent responsibilities, because parents not only have rights, but they have responsibilities, and that is covered in those procedural safeguards. Our staff can also help them with understanding what their rights, roles, and responsibilities are as we help them navigate through the special ed system. So I don't think we have time for the review. I think we've covered those things. We would like to say thank you because several parent training centers across the nation contributed to this, and here are some of them. And additionally, we would like to invite everyone to go to our website, insource.org. You will find my information. You will find all the staff's information. You will find webinars, printable resources, trainings. Our website is in over 100 languages. So please feel free to send families there. Please feel free to visit. because we would love to help you. Please visit us on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and look for our trainings, and please share our information. And with that, I want to thank you all for being part of this today. And we hope that you will contact us and take part in some of our trainings and our resource information.